Good. Thank you very much, Ian. So we'll have some questions now. Rory's got the roving mic. So, yeah, over to you.
Rory's going to be doing some of that exercise.
Hello?
Yes.
I think Edward said you had studied mathematics.
I had.
Particularly in relation to your locating vocation in widening circles, you had lots of circles and boundaries. And John Wimber talks about bounded sets and centered sets.
Yes.
And the centered set being a slightly, a different way of looking at our relationship with the world that's perhaps more helpful. Certainly it's one I find very helpful.
Yes.
How, if we take that model, how does that affect what we are thinking in terms of vocation?
I think you're right, and I think the centered set approach is very, it's kind of the thing at the moment in thinking about missional practice. Alan Hirsch, thank you, Alan Hirsch, who's written his books about rediscovering ancient ways. He's really strong on the whole centered set thing. And that's partly to do with, again, there was in a decade or two ago, there was a reconfiguration of, the whole relationship between belonging, believing, and behaving. And, in the past, we've generally said, first of all, you behave, then you believe, and then you can belong. And actually, we need to enable people to discover community and explore on the fringes. And that's why, actually, Anglican churches are very often better situated missionally than I think many of the free churches, which often have much clearer boundaries. So if you're in a Baptist church, there's a really clear demarcation between members and non-members, whereas in Anglican churches, it's very easy for people to come in on the fringe and to hang around. I think I would observe that focus on centered set is a good pragmatic missional strategy. I think I've got some questions about its theological status, because alongside that notion of centered set, there are some clear demarcations as well. So just simply thinking about discipleship, Jesus uses the language of following me and not following me. Jesus seems very comfortable to say to people, well, you're not in the kingdom, but you're not far off. And that's drawing a pretty clear line. There's a lawyer asks a question, he says, you're not far from the kingdom. You think, okay, that's pretty bounded. Just in practice, either you're in the Church of England, either you're ordained or you're not. Now, I recognise that lay readers and licensed lay ministers say, hang on, we're kind of feeling a bit caught around the boundary there, which I recognise that. But I think in terms of vocation, what I want to do in that diagram is simply recognise that actually every Christian has a vocation. The primary vocation is to know Jesus. Actually, within that, the vocation as to whether you're ordained or not, in biblical terms, is slightly secondary. But again, I just noticed that in one of my examples in Acts 13, Paul was part of a plural leadership, of course, because in the New Testament there's no monarchical leadership of any kind. Just saying. And the FAOC paper actually tackles that question and how we transmogrify it into the current setup in a very interesting way. But there came a decisive point of God's particular calling for Paul and Barnabas to decisively leave. So I think centered sets are useful in terms of the way of thinking about practical demarcations. I think when we encounter God's calling, God's vocation, that often involves us crossing some sort of boundary, or like Abraham actually physically leaving. I think it's part of the reason why, it's most of the reason why at least 7 of my 13 moves have come out specifically because of God's call in my life.
Ian, you said in your rule of life that if you failed, you felt that you had forgiveness. Is it possible?
No, I didn't say I felt I had forgiveness.
You would receive God's forgiveness. Is that correct?
Kind of. Carry on. Sorry, I interrupted your question.
I'm just wondering if we sometimes misread what we believe to be a vocation. And if that's the case, what is this forgiveness all about?
Well, I think I wrote that in my rule of life, not because I felt forgiven or that I ought to forgive, but that actually God was calling me to live in that pattern. I think for me, living in what God is calling me to must mean living in both grace, demand and forgiveness. And I think for me, God's vocation is always transformative. So it's always moving me on to something else. Now, I do from time to time have people say to me, well, what's your goal for the next 5 years? And I just sort of laugh because I say, well, I'm never going to, given that I've moved on average every 4.3 years, I'm never going to say I've got a goal for 5 years because I've no idea what the next thing God is going to call me to do. Now, having said that, I do have some goals. There are some things I'd like to write. There's some books I'd like to publish. I'd like to lose a bit more weight and get a bit fitter. And, I'd like certain things to happen in my family context and so on. But I want to recognize both God's sovereignty, and I also want to recognize that even at the age of 56, I haven't arrived, and that God's call is continuing on. Therefore, I still, and when I meet with my spiritual director, I want to say, look, I want to grow in this particular area. I feel God's calling me to this new thing. And I want to write something particular because God called me to do something or explore something, and that suddenly seems to be fruitful, and I need to actually change the plans I had and move into something else. So I think my sense of God's call on me is a continual one, and it always means I'm still growing and moving on. Somebody famous said, I'll be terribly embarrassed, I don't know who it is, I can't remember who it is, off the top of my head, that to grow is to change and to be perfect is to change much. Newman, there you go, John Henry Newman. So we live towards that eschatological future, but we're continually journeying towards it. So, as Paul says, we will only know as we are known in that final day. And that means that the journey is constantly one of both being drawn forward, but also living forgiveness for the fact that, even this day I haven't fulfilled that which God has called me to. So I'm a great Anglican in the sense that, some people say, oh, Anglicans are always going on about sin and forgiveness. I make no apology for that. That actually the deep structure of our liturgy begins with our encounter with the Holy God in laying aside and asking forgiveness for those, not because we're constantly beating ourselves up, but because actually in a fallen world, to be human and to be creaturely and to be finite, in a fallen world means inevitably to be sinful, and we won't be free from that until the final day. So for me, I think that's just it needs to be an integral part of my spiritual disciplines. Is that okay? That's why I love night prayer in common worship. I've got a bit of a beef about common worship daily prayer. I won't go on to that hobby horse now. I don't like evening prayer. I think it's Pelagian. But anyway, night prayer is what I like. And at the end of the day, we ask for forgiveness. And I think we clear accounts at the end of the day.
Yeah, just over there.
Well, somebody at the back is really going to make you exercise as well.
We'll
so.
go.
I just am really interested in something that keeps coming up as I've been thinking about this, is how, when we're engaging with communities that are struggling for survival, how do we find the space to liberate those, to give those people the confidence to explore vocation? Because if because of poverty or because of disability or because of dysfunction, you are in survival mode, have you got any thoughts about how we can, as their priests, move people, liberate people to find vocation?
Can I just, so don't give the microphone, can I ask you what you mean by finding vocation?
I think that if you are in survival mode, you do everything you can to put bread on the table, and that's your focus. And then when someone at church says, well, have you found, are you doing what you feel called to do? And then you might say, no, I've always felt called to do something completely different, but I don't have any choice about doing what I'm doing. I don't mean vocation as in priestly vocation.
No, sure.
I just mean doing what you're called to, not what you have to.
Yeah, sure. I think that would need quite a long conversation. I think for me, I just want to completely reconfigure how we see vocation. I want to first of all say the primary vocation is the vocation to discipleship, to the vocation to be in the kingdom. I think it's just again interesting that you use that language of interiorization. People saying, I'm doing what I have to do. I don't do what I feel I should be doing. And I think we need to put that, I'm not wanting to dismiss the significance of your situation, but I think the question is, in a society where most of society is self-actualizing and is thinking that I should be able to do what I want to do. So, for instance, with A-level results, I think I was really deeply shocked that the primary line in news reports about A-level results, because our daughter got A-level results, so I was particularly paying attention to it, was that people saying, I've got my grades, so I can now do what I want to do. So I just wonder what's happened to an education system where the primary goal of education is to enable people to self-actualize and to fulfill their dreams. I think we've got some fundamental rebuilding to do about how we understand that from a Christian perspective. And I realise the church has got a major stake in education through church schools. And I think we're not even at the beginning of really thinking what we ought to be doing in schools about that. I mean, I say that as having been a school governor. That actually education shouldn't simply be allowing people to fulfill their dreams, and it shouldn't simply be turning people into economic productive widgets who've got qualifications who are going to raise our national GDP, which is lagging behind Japan, where, by the way, 14-year-olds commit suicide. So I think our perspective is moving away from vocational self-actualization. But we're in a society where the majority think in terms of vocational self-actualization. Therefore, those minority communities like yours who are deprived of that do feel deprived by it, not just by the material circumstances. And I think we've got to be really careful that we don't introduce an idea of Christian vocation, which says, oh, well, what we want to do is shift you from that understanding to this one, to the majority culture one, because actually I don't think the majority culture one is correct. So we need to attend to the physical and practical needs of those kinds of communities. And there are lots of them in Nottingham. But we need to help people to rediscover what vocation means. We're very unusual as a society. We're completely atypical historically and globally in imagining that vocation is what we want to do. Most people in most ages in the past simply didn't have any choice. If my dad was a plumber, I was a plumber. There's actually a pretty good reason for that, because I've got an automatic apprenticeship and I've also got plumber's genes. But I don't think Christian understanding of vocation actually will cut across that. And in most generations, people have understood Christian vocation in a context where most people had no choice about their occupation. And then we need to say, okay, how do we explore vocation in terms of what does it mean to be a Christian, a follower, a disciple of Jesus, in the situation I'm already at? I know that's a very short answer, and I know that not being in that situation, there's a danger of it sounding very glib to you, but that's why I think it needs to be a longer conversation. But those are the things I'd want to explore.
Thank you. Was there one at the back? Yeah, sorry, Rory.
Exercise. Come, we should all jog in sympathy. Yeah, look at that. 3.4 seconds, impressive.
You said at the end that God's sovereign choice for us is better than our own choice. What do you think the signs are in our lives if it's God's choice rather than ours? So how do we discern that it's God's choice?
I felt slightly nervous in saying that because I'm very, very conscious of the possibility that if you say God's choice is better than our choice, and then if you say that God's choice is mediated through certain holy people, you make yourself extremely vulnerable to manipulation by powerful figures in the church community. So I'm very conscious of that. How do you discern the vocation? How do you discern the future? That's obviously a big subject. We could have a whole hour on that on its own. But it seems to me, from reflecting on my own experience and the way that interacts with those sort of 10 key points in the economy of God, I would say that it needs to be rooted in prayer and worship. The discernment is communal, not just individual, and it's about rediscovering identity and community. One of the things that studying the book of Revelation is, I've written a commentary on Revelation, by the way. Did I mention that? I think it's on the bookstore.
It is, yes.
Good, do buy that, just in passing. One of the things that Revelation is plagued by is this thing called dispensational premillennialism, which is the idea that Revelation is really written for our day and the end's about to come and it's blood moons and all that kind of stuff, yeah, and weird planets and things. And that all basically comes down to this chap called Darby, John Nelson Darby, and he was a disillusioned Irish Anglican clergyman. And in 1832, he went off to Plymouth and spent a year just thinking about it on his own and came up with all these ideas. And the main lesson from that is that when you do stuff on your own, it's really dangerous. and it derails people. So we need to discover communal discernment, but we also need to... I don't think I'm a temperamental charismatic, but I'm a charismatic by theological conviction in the sense that I think if you're a Trinitarian Christian, you actually need to recognize that the Spirit of God is at work. So I think I'd then add to that another dimension, which is actually attending to what the Spirit of God is saying, and that means actually taking seriously what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, that we are still in the end times, we're still in the age of the Spirit, and the Spirit of God is still at work. So we do need to attend to the things we just simply hear the Spirit saying, and we need to be in the practice of discerning those things. We need to be open to hearing what the Spirit says to us through other people in all sorts of different ways. And I think that doesn't mean departing from common sense. So on the one hand, what I do, for example, doesn't look very commonsensical. When I was 21, what I was most interested in multiple dimension binary spaces into which you locate error correcting codes. And you work out the Hamming distance, and I actually had a place to do a PhD, to spend 3 years thinking about that. And you know what? I found that quite exciting. I know that sounds really strange. I am a bit weird. And it had nothing to do with words, really. So on the one hand, God's call on me has been disruptive and discontinuous, and in one sense doesn't make sense. When you look at my CV doesn't make much sense, really. It's not very coherent. On the other hand, I just absolutely, I do find the thrill of creating something. When you get up in the morning and by 9 o'clock you've written a 2,000-word article, you've brought into being something which was not there 2 hours before. And there's an excitement in that. So on the other hand, that also makes sense. And somebody said to me yesterday over dinner, I read your blog, you clearly enjoy writing. So discerning, being in community, listening to what the Spirit says, doesn't mean setting aside those common sense observations as well, but it means sometimes those things are in tension. I just think the examples of particularly Jeremiah, if you're frustrated by your ministry situation now, just read Jeremiah. He wasn't a happy chappy. You probably haven't had to sit down at the bottom of a muddy well for weeks on end, or you haven't had to lie on a model of the city that you live in. So even if you've had a really bad day and a funeral's gone badly, you're not doing as badly as Jeremiah. And yet what he was doing was in response to the call of God. They're all thinking, if we get on the bus at 15:15, we can get a coffee before we get into the cathedral. That's what I'm thinking. Has anyone checked on Google Maps where there's a Costa? You have, haven't you? Some of you. Yeah, you have, Jane. I know, yeah. There was a question in the middle.
Sorry to thwart that plan then. You kind of mentioned about your 7 steps of call and change. I'm here, sorry. So do you think then a vocation can be seasonal, or is there for you an overarching sort of vocation of ministry, as it were, and writing as part of that now, and in the past it was something else? I'm also thinking whether vocations whether they can change, whether they can come to an end. So we were talking yesterday about the fact that the vocations in ministry, for example, can come with pain and all those kind of things. Yeah. If that pain leads to cynicism, yeah, is there maybe a change of vocation being suggested there? Do you think vocations change? Are they seasonal?
Undoubtedly. I think that particular question you ask, I think it's really important to separate what God's call on us is and how we pursue that call. And you kind of named the elephant in the room when you've talked about cynicism or disenchantment. And the reason I know that is because I'm in my 50s. And one of the causes, there's a lot of talk about clergy retiring, and so the number of clergy, we're preoccupied with on Archbishop's Council, which I'm on, and the numbers of clergy dropping off, and therefore we've got to increase the number of vocations. No, we've got to increase the number of vocations to ordain ministry. We have got to increase the number of vocations because we want, every member of the Church of England to understand their vocation. But what I found really fascinating looking at the stats, so there, using my mathematical background, is that the Central Statistics Unit, they track people leaving ministry. And a friend of mine, he's continued with his cell group from college. We were there at college at the same time. Out of 7 in the cell group, he's the only one still in parish ministry. In his 50s, okay? Now, okay, there's an issue there, okay? When I was 10 years in theological college, I always said, If God calls me back into parish ministry, I will go there tomorrow. If you're not prepared to go back into the coalface of parish ministry and you're in theological education, you need to leave. You can't be teaching other people how to minister if you're not prepared to minister yourself. So I always had a connection in the local church and was always doing things on a Sunday as well as during the week. Because that's what it's about. We need in the Church of England to recover the sense that, in terms of ordained ministry, the ambition is not to move from the parish to be an archdeacon, apologies, or a bishop. Those other things are there to serve parish ministry. Okay, this is the business. It's preaching, it's teaching, it's meeting with the people of God, it's sacramental ministry. That it's, you know, the BCB says, you know, the Church of God is where the sacraments are duly ministered and the Word of God is preached. That's the business end of things. And anything I do must serve that. That's why I call my blog Scholarship Serving Ministry. That's got to be the goal. And I would tomorrow, if God called me, in fact, actually, on 2 occasions, the church at the end of my road was looking for a vicar, and I said to my bishop, I said, should I go there? He said, maybe think about it. And then I didn't include this. Just again, in the summer, God said to me, do not apply for that job. Okay? End of. Fine. But I'd have to be prepared to go. I think that's the only way to live with integrity. But the stats say that of those who've left ministry in their 50s, the quarter have gone into sector ministry, a quarter have been promoted, quarter have done something else. A quarter, they've got no idea where they've gone. So a quarter of those who've gone out of parish ministry in their 50s, nobody knows where they've gone. And the answer is, they've got cynical. It's been too much. To do that for 30 years is hard work. It's slog. And we need to find ways to re-equip, re-envision, and enable people to have a fresh sense of calling. But yeah, no, calling can last for different seasons. And certainly I haven't been writing all of my ministry life. It may be that God calls me into something else. Given that I've got 11 books I'd like to write, I hope that won't happen anytime soon. And because writing's physically non-demanding, I'm not particularly expecting to retire anytime soon. I don't think retirement is actually a biblical notion. I worked on a kibbutz in my gear off, and they didn't have retirement. As people got older, they just had less demanding and shorter hours in the job, because actually vocation, work gives people meaning, and it's a way of engaging community. So yes, it can, but I don't think there's any particular formula.
Probably got time for one more.
Come on, give them a round of applause. Yay!
You were talking quite a bit about God's sovereign decision in calling us. And I was just wondering where in that our agency in that whole thing works. I was just thinking about one thing that came to mind was the story in Genesis 32 where Jacob goes and fights with God and struggles with God, and it's in this whole process that he gets his calling and get his name changed. Yeah. Or Mary, who at the Annunciation asks, "What is this all about?" Yes. And God waits for her consent before things happen. Yeah. How do you, in that whole kind of sense of God's sovereign decision, see our own agency in calling, and how does that affect our that kind of that work between God and us?
Sure. Well, I think that's absolutely. I mean, that's a really vital question. Thank you for asking it. I think our agency is really central. When I was actually the church I went to before I started ordination training, the vicar there who'd actually been working in the Arctic, and as a result he got snow blindness, and it was a really, really costly ministry. And his view was, he said, I can't remember if he said it to me or he said it in preaching, he said, when God tells you to jump, the only question you ask is how high. Now, I don't think that's true, actually. And I know I've talked a lot about the sovereignty of God and about focusing on the caller, but it seems to me when God told Moses to jump, Moses said, God, I'm not really good at jumping, and you know what, jumping is not a really good idea. I jumped before and I got into real trouble. Besides which, my brother is a much better jumper than me. I really think you've got the wrong person here. I mean, and I think there's no doubt that the scriptures, the whole scriptures, particularly the New Testament, see the sovereignty of God and human agency as entirely interlocked. A friend of mine just published his PhD a few months ago, and I've reviewed it on the blog. Did I mention I write a blog? Yeah. I've also written a commentary on Revelation. Did I mention that? And he said, what's really bizarre, his PhD was on 1 Corinthians, and on on the rebuke and encouragement. And what he notices in 1 Corinthians is that at certain times Paul says, God is sovereign, you will not fail, he will keep you safe. Ta-da! So you can relax. And then at other times he says, what are you doing? You're putting your whole salvation in jeopardy. If you do that kind of stuff, you won't even see the kingdom of heaven. You know, what is Paul doing? I mean, and scholarship says either Paul meant the first one, but was actually the second one was just a rhetorical kick up the backside, or he meant the second one was just saying the first one to kind of say, you know, it's okay really, but you really need to get right together. And actually, what my friend Andrew's PhD said is that, you know what, he's saying both. And he's saying both because Paul sees divine sovereignty and human agency as intermingle and integrating. And I think there are times when God says to us, until we're saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And sometimes God says, do you know what? What do you feel like doing? Because actually, again, if we locate the vocation to particular occupation and ministry, we locate it into the larger pattern of saying, do you know what? God's fundamental vocation is to know him. I mean, the classic example, I guess, is in John 21, you know, where Jesus says 3 times to Peter, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Do you love me, feed my sheep? Do you love me, feed my sheep? Do you love me, feed my sheep? And there's a whole thing about whether the words really mean anything different there, and there's a blog post on that. But Peter then looks at what and says, what about him? And it's the beloved disciple who wrote the gospel and says, well, if he's going to stay till I come, what's that to you? And then there's a rumor goes around. But what's really interesting is that Peter and the beloved disciple actually have quite distinct vocations. And in the end, Peter's testimony, marturia, is to die. John's testimony, marturia, is to write the gospel as a testimony. And there's a sense in which that's an example saying, well, okay, he's going to do this and he's going to do that, and big deal, okay? What matters is that you follow Jesus. He says, what matters is that? Follow me. And in the end, we can get really uptight about, oh, have I heard the right, maybe come back to your question, have I heard God's call direction? Am I following my calling? Sometimes I think God says to us, look, just relax, simmer down, okay? It doesn't really matter whether you're in the right parish or not. I just want you to be faithful, all right? I just want you to follow me, preach good news, just get on with it. Don't worry.